The campus of Humber College's Lakeshore site spreads along the north shore of Lake Ontario in Etobicoke, low and broad beneath a wide Ontario sky. The red brick of the original cottage buildings is still here, 12 of them, arranged across a rolling lawn that runs down toward the water. Their Georgian windows looking out across the lake with an expression that students passing between classes do not pause to read. The buildings are warm in morning light. They have a domestic quality, almost residential, that makes it difficult, standing among them, to understand what they were. But this is not a story about a college campus. Between 1890 and 1976, this ground held 500 acres of working farmland. The farm produced vegetables, grain, dairy, and pork on a scale that provisioned the institution and generated surplus revenue for the Ontario government. The labor that produced all of this, the planting, the harvesting, the milking before dawn, the feeding of livestock through an Ontario winter, was performed by the people living in those red brick cottages. They were patients. They were paid nothing. They were not asked. In their medical files, this was the hospital for the insane, Mimico, later Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital. For 86 years, it operated on a premise the Ontario government never stated plainly and never examined officially until the thing was already over. That the distinction between therapy and labor would be determined not by clinical need, but by institutional convenience, and that the people on whose bodies that distinction was applied would have no mechanism to contest it. When does treatment become exploitation, and who gets to decide which one it is? This is the story of two institutions living inside the same red brick cottages. One delivered genuine care to people in genuine need. The other ran a farm. If the histories that institutions prefer to leave undocumented are the kind you want to keep recovering, you're welcome to subscribe and stay with me. To understand what Lakeshore became, you have to understand the world that built it. A world in the grip of a genuine and genuinely dangerous optimism. The mid to late 19th century was the age of the asylum, not as a place of punishment, or not only as a place of punishment, but as a technology of healing. The reformers who built the first great psychiatric institutions believed, with something close to religious conviction, that madness was curable. That the mad had been driven mad by bad environments, by poverty, by overcrowding, by the moral chaos of industrial city life, and that a good environment would reverse the damage. Fresh air, useful labor, regular routine, moral guidance. They called it moral treatment. It was the most humane psychiatric framework the 19th century produced. Its central premise was order. The asylum would provide what the disordered outside world could not: a controlled, therapeutic environment in which the patient would gradually recover the rational faculties that suffering had suppressed. The early reports from institutions operating on this model, from the York Retreat in England, from Bloomingdale in New York, from the Toronto Asylum under Dr. Joseph Workman, were genuinely hopeful. Recovery rates were cited. Discharge numbers were published. Ontario built its psychiatric system on this foundation. Between Confederation in 1867 and the end of the century, the provincial government established 6 asylums. Each was built on extensive grounds, in accordance with the moral treatment model's insistence on rural air and space. Each was attached to a farm. The farm was not incidental, it was ideological. Work, structured, purposeful, outdoor physical work, was considered a core therapeutic modality by virtually every prominent alienist of the era. Samuel Tuke at the York Retreat had argued, and believed he had demonstrated, that patients who worked recovered faster than patients who did not. In Ontario, the Inspector of Asylums cited farm productivity figures in his annual reports alongside discharge rates, not because the two were unrelated, but because in the institutional logic of the era, they expressed the same thing. Recovery was legible as productivity. The patient who worked was the patient who was getting better. The farm that produced was the asylum that was doing its job. This equation carried within it a compression that no one in 1890 paused to examine. It conflated the patient's therapeutic benefit with the institution's economic output. It made it structurally impossible in practice to distinguish between work that was genuinely helping and work that was genuinely needed, because the farm always needed the work, and the patient was always available to perform it. The world that built Lakeshore had a word for this arrangement. It called it progress. John Woodburn Langmuir was not a doctor. He was an administrator of such systematic thoroughness that Ontario's first provincial government made him its inspector of prisons and public charities in 1868, a title containing responsibility for everything the province preferred not to look at directly: its jails, its asylums, its houses of refuge, its reformatories. He had emigrated from Scotland as a young man, made himself indispensable to the conservative machinery of early Ontario, and by 1868 was the person the province trusted to rationalize its most difficult institutions. He was not sentimental about this work. He was efficient. Langmuir spent 18 years as inspector. In those 18 years, he built the provincial asylum network into a system with consistent standards, coherent reporting requirements, and a documentary framework that replaced the episodic improvisations of the pre-Confederation era. He published annual reports that are among the most detailed institutional documents in 19th century Canadian government. He tracked admission rates and discharge rates and death rates and occupancy percentages with the precision of a man who believed that what could be measured could be managed. He was right about that. He was also, in his careful management of figures, constructing a framework that would take decades to reveal its deeper consequences. Langmuir was a committed advocate of the farm model. His annual reports cite farm productivity figures for each provincial asylum with evident satisfaction, not merely as evidence of self-sufficiency, but as evidence of therapeutic success. In his 1876 report, he described the farm labor program at the Toronto Asylum as perhaps the most powerful curative agent at our disposal, one that unites physical benefit with moral improvement in a manner that no pharmaceutical preparation can approach. He was also, in the same document, noting the savings generated by patient labor on each institution's operating costs. He did not appear to find this combination troubling. The two observations, therapeutic benefit and financial savings, sat in adjacent paragraphs, without the question that should have separated them. In 1876, Langmuir submitted a proposal to the Ontario government for a new facility on the Lake Ontario shoreline, designed from the ground up around the principles he had spent a decade refining. It would use the cottage system, pioneered in Scotland, which housed patients in small residential buildings rather than a single massive ward block. It would have a substantial farm, capable of provisioning the institution entirely and generating surplus for external sale. The government approved the proposal in 1879. Langmuir had retired from the inspectorate by the time the institution opened, but everything he had built into, its design, the farm acreage, the reporting structure, the administrative logic that would track agricultural output in the same institutional frame as clinical outcomes, was his. He died in 1915 and was remembered as one of the architects of Ontario's progressive welfare state. The asylum he had designed was described in his obituaries as a monument to his humanitarian vision. Not one of the patients who had worked the farms his system depended on was named in those obituaries. The first medical superintendent appointed to run the new hospital was Dr. William Burgess, a physician trained in the English County Asylum tradition, who arrived in Ontario in 1889 to supervise the final construction and prepare the clinical framework. He was methodical, thorough, and entirely convinced of the therapeutic value of farm labor. His first annual report, submitted in 1891, describes the farm operations with technical detail and connects those figures directly to patient outcomes. Those patients engaged in outdoor agricultural pursuits show uniformly better progress than those confined to indoor occupations or to ward routine. He had no control group. He had no method for separating patients who improved because of the farm work from patients who were assigned to the farm because they were already stable enough to work safely outdoors. The farm was simultaneously the treatment and the proof that the treatment worked. A closed system of institutional confirmation that would sustain itself without external examination for the next 80 years. Burgess remained at Lakeshore for 22 years. The superintendents who followed inherited his framework without questioning it, because the farm continued to produce, the government continued to receive its productivity reports, and the institutional arrangement Langmuir had designed continued to operate with the self-sustaining efficiency of a system in which everyone's incentives pointed in the same direction. Construction of the Hospital for the Insane, Mimico, was completed in phases between 1888 and 1894 under provincial architect Kivas Tully, the same architect who had designed the Hamilton Asylum a decade earlier, who had by this point developed a restrained institutional vocabulary: red Credit Valley brick, Georgian proportions, windows broad enough to admit light without compromising enclosure. The cottage system at Lakeshore was Tully's most ambitious commission. Rather than a single central ward block, the institution consisted of 12 separate residential cottages, arranged across a south-facing slope that descended gradually toward the lake. Each cottage housed between 40 and 60 patients. Each had its own kitchen, its own day room, its own sleeping quarters. The covered corridors linking the cottages to the central administrative building were open to the air, fresh air being considered therapeutically essential, the prevailing westerly wind off the lake presumed to carry something curative. The central administration building sat at the crest of the property, 4 stories of brick and stone, with a tower visible across the flat lakeshore landscape. The superintendent's office occupied the 2nd floor, a broad window facing south across the cottage rooflines to the water. It was a room designed for a man who was in command of something. Below and east of the cottage cluster, the farm began. The original farm acreage was 300 acres. By the turn of the century, it had grown to 500. It comprised arable fields, a market garden, an orchard, dairy barns, a piggery, a poultry house, a slaughterhouse, root cellars, equipment sheds, and a tool workshop. The farm had its own superintendent, a civilian provincial employee, a working farmer, who reported to the medical superintendent on matters of patient labor allocation and to the Provincial Department of Agriculture on matters of farm output. This reporting structure placed him at the intersection of 2 institutional systems that used different languages for the same activity. The Department of Agriculture wanted yield data, the medical superintendent wanted occupational therapy documentation, and the farm superintendent provided both from the same operations, without either receiving office being required to examine what the other was looking at. The laundry occupied a low brick building on the north edge of the property. It was among the largest laundry operations in Western Ontario, servicing not only Lakeshore's own linen, but, within a decade of opening, the linen of several other provincial institutions in the region. The output was substantial. The labor required to produce it came from the wards. The boiler room sat beneath the central administration building, accessible by a tunnel from the mechanical plant. The boilers that heated all 12 cottages ran 24 hours a day through the Ontario winter. They required continuous monitoring, consistent calibration, and the kind of attentive maintenance that, in any civilian setting, would require licensed operators and a documented wage. On the farm superintendent's desk, at any given moment between 1890 and the 1970s, sat a thick, green-covered account book. It recorded acreage, yield, livestock census, and labor hours broken down by task. The labor hours column ran down every page, the hours of work performed each week, sorted by field crew, laundry shift, kitchen rotation, boiler room detail, complete, precise, useful to the 2 offices that reviewed it. The book had no column for the names of the people who produced those hours. The people who produced them were not workers. They were patients receiving occupational therapy. The therapy was recorded in their medical files. The output of the therapy was recorded in the farm ledger. The 2 documents, read side by side, would have told the complete story of what Lakeshore actually was. They were never required to be read side by side. The institution opened on November 3rd, 1890. The first patients arrived by train from the overcrowded Toronto Asylum, walked the road to the grounds, and saw the lake to their left and the brick cottages rising on the slope ahead. It was November. The fields had already been harvested. The ground was turned for winter. The farm was quiet. It would not stay quiet for long. For its first 2 decades, the Hospital for the Insane, Mimico, embodied something that Victorian psychiatry genuinely believed in: the possibility that the right environment could restore a damaged mind. The cottage system worked, to the degree that any institutional system works when it has adequate resources and committed staff. The small scale of each residential unit allowed for a degree of individual attention that the great single-block asylums could not provide. Patients knew the nurses in their cottage by name. Nurses knew patients. In its earliest years, the farm was genuinely integrated into the therapeutic life of the institution in ways that cannot be entirely dismissed. Patients who chose to work outdoors did. Those who preferred the garden to the field could say so. The medical reports from Dr. Burgess's era describe patients developing skills, expressing preferences, taking visible satisfaction in work they had chosen. These were not manufactured observations for government reports. This was what moral treatment looked like when it had the space to breathe. In 1895, the Ontario Medical Association published a report praising the Mimico model as the most advanced psychiatric facility in Canada. Visitors came from England and the United States to examine the cottage system. For a brief period, Lakeshore was genuinely a source of professional pride for Ontario psychiatry. The farm's annual output by 1900 was substantial: 40,000 pounds of pork, 8,000 pounds of butter, 3,000 bushels of oats, 60 tons of hay, a market garden that supplied the institution with virtually all of its vegetable requirements from spring through early winter. The Provincial Department of Agriculture's annual report for 1901 cited the Mimico farm as among the most productive agricultural operations in the county, not among institutional farms, but among all farms. This was also, in a sense, the province had not yet been required to examine, the point at which the farm's therapeutic purpose and its economic purpose became inseparable. An institution whose farm ranked among the county's most productive was an institution whose farm was working hard. An institution whose patients were the farm's primary labor force was an institution whose patients were working hard. The correlation was real. The question of whether the correlation served the patients or the farm was not raised. The medical superintendent's annual report for 1903 contains, in paragraph 4, following its patient statistics, a sentence that rests there without comment. The farm operations continue to contribute materially to the institution's operating costs through surplus sales, reducing the per-patient cost to the province to levels not achievable by funded labor alone. This sentence is followed by the weather report for the growing season. No question appears between them. The social life of the institution was genuine. The annual concerts, the seasonal dances, the athletic competitions that moral treatment prescribed as necessary counterweights to the ordered routine. Patients put on theatrical performances. There was a brass ensemble. Christmas drew staff families from across the surrounding townships. These were not performances staged for visiting inspectors. They were the regular rhythm of institutional life as Burgess understood it. And underneath all of it, through every season, the farm ran. The First World War did not close Lakeshore. It overcrowded it. Staff left for military service and were replaced by people with less experience. Admissions continued at pre-war rates, while discharges slowed. By 1918, the institution held nearly 800 patients in a physical plant designed for 500. The overcrowding that arrived with the war did not resolve when the war ended. Through the 1920s, the population climbed. Through the Depression, when poverty and social dislocation drove admission rates across Ontario's provincial institutions to historic highs. Lakeshore absorbed patients for whom it had no space in programs, it had no staff to run. By 1935, the institution held over 1,200 patients. The cottages designed for 40 held 60. The individual therapeutic attention the cottage model depended on had, in practice, dissolved. In this context, the farm became something different from what Langmuir had designed it to be. It became essential, not therapeutically essential, but economically essential. The overcrowded institution needed the food the farm produced. The provincial government, managing a Depression-era budget against the demands of an expanding institutional population, needed the operational savings that patient labor represented. There was no budget line to replace patient labor with paid civilian workers. There was no political will to create one. The word therapy remained in the documentation. What it described had changed. The farm was already waiting. The shift from therapeutic farm to extractive labor operation did not happen on a single identifiable date. It happened in the accumulation of small administrative decisions, none of which, viewed individually, appeared to constitute a policy change. A patient who had been working well in the garden was kept on the garden assignment after her clinical notes indicated she no longer required the specific intervention the outdoor work had originally represented, because the garden needed her. A patient who had been assigned to the laundry as a short-term routine building measure remained on the laundry for a year, then 3, then a decade, because the laundry needed the hands. A patient assigned to the boiler room, because his file indicated a background in industrial trades, remained at the boiler for 14 years, because the plant needed an operator, and because no one was required to ask whether a man admitted for a nervous breakdown needed to maintain a heating system in order to recover. The occupational therapy documentation evolved to accommodate this. By the 1930s, the clinical language describing work assignments in patient records had become uniform and formulaic. Patient engaged in outdoor occupational therapy with apparent benefit appeared in chart notes for patients working the fields, regardless of whether the ward staff had observed any specific clinical benefit. The phrase was a category, not an observation. Documentation was catching up to practice rather than guiding it. The civilian farm superintendent submitted his labor reports to the PAUD, Medical Superintendent's Office, which forwarded production figures to the Department of Agriculture and labor cost savings figures to the Department of Health. Neither department was required to reconcile those figures with the clinical records in which the labor was characterized as therapy. Neither had a mechanism for doing so, and neither appears, in the archival record, to have thought one was needed. Ordinary people came to Lakeshore in genuine distress, carrying depression, grief, breakdowns that were the product of lives that had asked too much of a body and mind that had nothing left. They came for help. They were given an assignment. The assignment was presented as part of their treatment. The treatment was the assignment, and the farm required the assignment to continue indefinitely in a great many cases, long after any clinical rationale for continuation had dissolved into institutional habit. Dr. Albert Routledge was appointed medical superintendent of Lakeshore in 1948, the year the Canadian Mental Health Association published More for the Mind, its landmark call for the complete transformation of Canadian psychiatric institutions. He served until 1971. He presided over the farm in its most systematized, most fully operational, most completely extractive phase. Routledge was not an incompetent administrator. The documentation he left behind, annual reports, departmental correspondence, internal memos preserved in the provincial archives, reveals a man genuinely managing a difficult institution with limited resources, who believed, with the conviction of a generation of psychiatrists trained before the pharmacological revolution, in the value of structured activity for long-term institutionalized patients. He was not dissembling when he wrote, in his annual report for 1952, that the occupational program, of which the farm and industrial assignments form the core, continues to demonstrate its value as a means of maintaining patient function and morale. He believed this. His professional framework gave him the language in which it was believable, and the institution's economic pressures gave him no incentive to search for evidence that might complicate it. What Routledge managed with particular efficiency was the labor allocation system. By the mid-1950s, the occupational therapy department maintained a weekly assignment register. Which patient was on which field crew, which on the laundry shift, which in the kitchen, which at the boiler. Patients who performed reliably on an assignment were kept on it. Patients who resisted were documented as non-compliant with therapeutic programming. Non-compliance had consequences. The most cooperative patients worked outdoors. The least cooperative were assigned to less desirable indoor tasks. This was described, in the administrative language of the institution, as matching patients to assignments appropriate to their functional level. What it also described was a behavioral management system in which cooperation with unpaid labor was incentivized by better working conditions, and resistance was managed by the threat of worse ones. In October of 1957, Routledge wrote to the Deputy Minister of Health requesting a new grain harvester to replace aging equipment that patient labor alone could not compensate for in terms of mechanical efficiency. In the letter's second paragraph, he estimated that the patient labor program saved the province between $40,000 and $60,000 annually at current agricultural labor market rates. $40,000 to $60,000 annually, saved by the labor of patients receiving no wages. The deputy minister approved the harvester. He did not respond to the second paragraph. The harvester was delivered in the spring of 1958. The patients operated it. Routledge retired in 1971 with a commendation from the Ontario government for his years of service. His obituary described him as a dedicated advocate for the humane treatment of the mentally ill. He was not wrong about wanting to help his patients. He was wrong, and the institution was wrong, and the province was wrong about what helping them required. The patient labor system at Lakeshore operated through 4 principal assignment categories: the farm, the laundry, the kitchen and food service, and the maintenance and mechanical plant. Each category was administered by a civilian supervisor reporting to the occupational therapy department, which reported to the medical superintendent. On the farm, labor was seasonal but extended. Growing season ran from late April through October. During those months, field crews of 20 to 40 patients worked daily shifts in the arable fields, the market garden, the dairy barn, the piggery, and the orchard. Winter months carried reduced crews managing livestock, processing preserved goods, and maintaining equipment. Farm output was reported quarterly to the Provincial Department of Agriculture. The labor cost savings were calculable. By the mid-1960s, the provincial minimum agricultural wage was $1.10 per hour. A farm crew of 30 patients working 40 hours per week across a 30-week growing season represented, at that rate, approximately $39,600 annually in avoided labor costs from the farm operation alone. That figure does not include the laundry, the kitchen, or the mechanical plant. The laundry processed linen not only for Lakeshore, but under contract for several other provincial institutions, and during one documented period in the 1950s for a private hospital in Mississauga. Those external contracts generated direct revenue for the institution. The labor servicing them was patient labor. The financial relationship between the revenue generated and the patients who generated it existed in 2 separate administrative offices that were never required to reference each other. The kitchen and food service operations fed approximately 1,200 people 3 meals a day. The patients who staffed those kitchens, preparing, cooking, serving, washing, were performing the same work performed by kitchen staff at any institutional food service operation of comparable scale, at 0 labor cost to the institution. Their charts documented this as kitchen occupational therapy, patient engaged in food preparation with demonstrated benefit to social functioning. The benefit was specified: The compensation was not, because compensation was not part of the category. The maintenance and mechanical operations, the boiler room, the grounds crew, the carpentry shop, the plumbing and electrical details, drew on patients who had, in many cases, arrived at the institution with skilled trade experience acquired before admission. Tradesmen, mechanics, farmers. Their pre-institutional expertise was being applied to institutional operations without compensation, without documentation as employment, and without any mechanism by which the work could be credited to them outside the institution's walls. The province's annual estimates, submitted to the Ontario Legislature, included a line for farm operating costs at each provincial psychiatric institution. The estimates for Lakeshore consistently showed farm operating costs running below comparable private farm operations of similar scale. By margins, the farm's productivity figures alone could not explain. The difference was the labor cost that did not appear in the estimates because it did not appear on any payroll. In the occupational therapy records for the same period, thousands of entries describe patient participation in farm, laundry, kitchen, and maintenance assignments. They describe, uniformly and without significant variation across 4 decades of documentation, the patient as benefiting from the work. The specific benefit is rarely identified. The clinical rationale linking this patient's diagnosis to this specific work assignment is, in the majority of VIAPO's entries, absent entirely. Some of those entries carry names in the patient header. Those names have histories the ledger does not record. Numbers, even these numbers, can become institutional. So let us remember 3 names. Harold Welsh arrived at Lakeshore in the spring of 1934. He was 23 years old. He had walked into the admitting office of a Toronto General Hospital the previous week, unable to stop shaking, unable to sleep, unable to work, unable to do the simple things that a working body should be able to do. He had been employed at an auto parts factory in Etobicoke before the Depression shuttered it in 1931. He had spent 3 years trying to find work in a city where a third of the workforce was unemployed, and 3 years of that kind of pressure had done to his nervous system what 3 years of that kind of pressure does. His diagnosis on admission to Lakeshore was neurasthenia with anxiety features. He was 23 years old. He had lost his job. He had never been sick before in his life, and he was placed in Cottage 7 on the east side of the grounds. Within 3 weeks of his arrival, he was assigned to the farm. His occupational therapy notes across the early years of his assignment describe him as industrious, cooperative, and responsive to the outdoor program. His clinical notes describe gradual improvement in his anxiety symptoms. This was documented, in the institutional logic of the era, as evidence of the farm's therapeutic value. Whether the improvement was a result of the farm work, or occurred in the ordinary way that many anxiety presentations stabilize over time with any consistent routine, is not a question the records asked. Harold Welsh worked the farm for 31 years. In that time, he planted crops, harvested crops, cared for livestock, maintained equipment, and did every physical thing that the agricultural operation of a 500-acre institutional farm required. He did it through Ontario summers and Ontario winters, through 3 decades of growing seasons. The farm superintendent's maintenance logs, among the few documents that describe him as an individual rather than as a patient category, note in 1952 that he was invaluable to the operations of the East Fields. Invaluable. The word appears in an agricultural record. It does not appear in his medical file. In 1965, Harold Welsh was discharged. He was 54 years old. He had arrived at 23 and had spent his entire working life, the 31 years that in any other context would have built a career, an employment record, a pension, inside a psychiatric institution, performing work for which he had not been paid and which had not been recorded on any document he could present to the world outside. He was given $3 and a bus ticket to Toronto. He had no employment history that the Ontario Department of Manpower could use to help him find work. He had 31 years of farm experience that, had been performed in a setting which categorized it as occupational therapy rather than agricultural labor, so it appeared on no resume, was creditable toward no pension, and was compensable under no labor standard that existed in 1965. Harold Welsh died in a West Toronto rooming house in 1971. He was 60 years old. The cause of death recorded on his death certificate was cardiac failure. He received no compensation from the province for 31 years of farm labor. His case was not included in any subsequent provincial review of patient work practices. His name does not appear on any public acknowledgement related to the institution's labor program. He planted, by conservative estimate from the farm records, more than 4,000 acres of crops across his years at Lakeshore. Every bushel is in the agricultural records of the provincial archive. His name is not. Mary Delansky was 19 years old in 1948 when her family brought her to Lakeshore. She had begun, in the months before admission, to withdraw from the world with the particular completeness that frightens everyone around it. Not a gradual retreat, but a sudden disappearance behind a surface. Her parents could see but not reach. She stopped eating with the family. She stopped responding consistently to her name. She spent hours in her room, engaged in repetitive behaviors she would not explain. Her diagnosis was schizophrenia. She was placed in one of the women's cottages. Within 2 months of her arrival, she was assigned to the laundry. Before admission, her family had told the admitting physician that Mary had wanted to be a hairdresser. She had enrolled in a beauty culture program at a Toronto vocational school when her symptoms began. She had, her mother said, a patience with detail and a gentleness with her hands that the work required. She had expected to have a career. Mary Delansky worked in the laundry at Lakeshore for 18 years. 6 days a week, the industrial mangle, the wash, vats, the alkaline soap, the steam, the noise that was audible from the adjacent building through a closed door. Her clinical record across those 18 years contains, at regular intervals, notes describing her as stable, occupationally engaged, and responsive to the structured program. Nowhere in those notes is there a documented clinical rationale connecting her specific diagnosis to the specific therapeutic modality represented by institutional laundry work. In 1959, her psychiatrist's chart reads, "Patient continues in laundry program. No change in presentation. Discharge not currently indicated." No change in presentation. She remained in the laundry. In 1966, Mary Delansky was transferred to a nursing home in Mississauga as part of the early deinstitutionalization movement that was beginning to reduce Lakeshore's population. The nursing home had no laundry for patients to work in. Her structured program ended. Her clinical notes from the nursing home describe her as disoriented following transition, requiring a reorientation to new environment. She had spent 18 years building a routine. The decision that the routine was over had been made without consulting her. She died in 1989 at the age of 60. She received no compensation for 18 years of laundry service. The external laundry contracts she had helped service, contracts that generated direct revenue for the institution, are documented in Lakeshore's administrative records. She appears in those records only as an occupational therapy participant. She is nowhere recorded as a worker, because she was not a worker. She was a patient, and patients were treated. Thomas Auld came to Lakeshore in 1957. He was 41 years old. His wife had died in February of that year, a heart attack in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and Thomas, who had come home from his shift at the Toronto Transit Commission to find her, had not recovered. He had not returned to his own shape. 2 months after her death, his general practitioner recognized that what Thomas was carrying required more than the GP's office could provide. Thomas had been a boiler operator at the TTC for 11 years. Before that, he had worked in the heating plant of a downtown Toronto office building. He understood heating systems the way a tradesman understands the physical reality of his trade, the particular sounds a system makes before it fails, the adjustments that no manual can teach, because they require years of listening before they can be heard. He was, by any occupational definition, a skilled industrial tradesman. He was assigned to Lakeshore's boiler room within 6 weeks of his admission. The boiler room assignment ran for 14 years. Thomas Auld maintained the heating system of a 12-cottage psychiatric institution from 1957 to 1971. He worked with the same professional thoroughness he had brought to the TTC plant, keeping the boilers calibrated, identifying mechanical problems before they became emergencies, maintaining through Ontario winters the heat that 12 cottages and an administrative building required around the clock. The hospital's maintenance supervisor's notes describe him in 1963 as the most reliable and technically capable member of the maintenance crew. He was, in the documentation of his medical record, a patient receiving occupational therapy. In 1971, Thomas Auld was discharged. He was 55 years old. He returned to Toronto and applied for employment as a boiler operator, the skilled trade he had practiced his entire adult life, the work he had performed for 14 consecutive years inside Lakeshore's mechanical plant, the work at which the institutional record had judged him the most capable operator available. The Ontario Licensing Board for Boiler Operators required, for any certification, documentation of supervised work experience from a recognized employer. The work experience Thomas Auld had to document was 14 years of boiler operation at a provincial psychiatric hospital, recorded in that hospital's maintenance logs as occupational therapy performed by a psychiatric patient. The licensing board could not accept it. It wasn't employment, it was treatment. Thomas Auld could not prove to the board that he had operated a boiler for the past 14 years, because in every official record, he had not. He had been treated. He found work eventually. Day labor, general maintenance, nothing in his trade. He never returned to the skilled industrial work he had performed for most of his adult life. He died in 1994. He had written to the Ontario government in 1985 after reading about a class action related to patient labor at another provincial institution. The letter asked whether any mechanism existed by which his experience at Lakeshore might be officially recognized. He received a form acknowledgement from the Ministry of Health. He heard nothing further. These three represent hundreds more. The patients who spent years or decades performing skilled and unskilled labor for an institution that recorded their work as treatment and kept their wages. The ones who left without employment histories or pension credits or professional documentation. The ones who had been institutionalized too long to reconstruct a life outside, or who had been too cognitively affected by illness, by medication, by the particular erosion that indefinite confinement performs on the self, to navigate the bureaucracies that might have provided recourse. Many have no surviving family members who know what they built, or how long they built it, or that the province once counted the value of their labor in its official budget estimates. They were owed an accounting. The accounting was never given. In 1969, the Ontario Department of Health commissioned an internal review of occupational therapy practices at 5 provincial psychiatric institutions, including Lakeshore. The review was not prompted by external pressure or survivor complaint. It was prompted by an administrative problem. The deinstitutionalization movement was beginning to reduce patient populations across the provincial system, and as populations declined, the farm operations that patient labor had sustained were facing a labor shortage the province had not budgeted to address. The question the department wanted answered was logistical: how to scale the farms down as the patient workforce contracted. The answer the review produced was different from the question. The reviewing committee, 3 departmental psychiatrists, and a retained labor economist, examined patient work assignment records against clinical records at each of the 5 institutions. At Lakeshore, the review found what the 2-document system had always made visible to anyone who looked at both simultaneously. A substantial proportion of patient work assignments had no documented clinical rationale in the corresponding medical files. The occupational therapy designation existed in the OT records. The therapeutic justification for applying it, the specific clinical indication, the connection between this patient's diagnosis and this work task, was absent from the medical file in the majority of reviewed cases. The committee's report, completed in the spring of 1970, used careful language. It described a pattern of work assignment practice that in a substantial number of cases appears to have been determined by operational requirements rather than documented clinical need. It recommended that future assignments require documented clinical rationale and periodic clinical review. It recommended that the province examine the legal basis for requiring unpaid patient participation in work operations. It recommended that the Department of Labor be consulted on whether existing arrangements were consistent with Ontario Labour Standards legislation. The report was classified. It was distributed to the Deputy Minister of Health, the 5 institutional superintendents, and the Minister's office. It was not released to the public. It was not shared with any patient advocacy organization. It was not forwarded to the Department of Labor, the consultation the report itself had specifically requested. The patients whose assignments the review had documented were not told what the review had found about them. The reforms it recommended were implemented gradually across the early 1970s. New documentation requirements for occupational therapy assignments, new review mechanisms for long-term work placements. These reforms were presented publicly as a modernization of psychiatric practice in response to developments in the field. They were not described as a response to a finding that the existing program had been operating, in a substantial number of cases, as an uncompensated labor arrangement. The 1970 review that had produced that finding was not mentioned. In 1976, the Hospitals Act amendments formally ended the practice of requiring patient participation in institutional work operations. The amendments did not reference the 1970 review. They did not acknowledge the practices the review had documented. They did not provide any mechanism for identifying or compensating the patients the review had described. The review was mentioned once in the subsequent academic literature, in a single footnote in a 1983 clinical journal paper on the history of occupational therapy in Ontario psychiatric institutions, where it was described as an internal administrative study. The footnote did not describe its findings. The paper had a limited readership. The review remains classified today. Freedom of Information requests for its full text have been declined by the Ministry of Health on the grounds that it constitutes an internal, deliberative record whose disclosure could interfere with the deliberative process of government, a statutory protection designed for documents whose release might compromise ongoing policy development, applied here to a document whose subject institution has been closed for over 4 decades. Not one administrator was asked, in any public proceeding, to account for submitting labor cost savings figures to the province, while characterizing the underlying labor as occupational therapy. Not one superintendent who signed decades of undocumented work assignments was censured or investigated. Not one member of the reviewing committee was permitted to discuss its findings publicly. No press conference was called. No legislative committee reviewed the report. The patients who had done the work were never told what the 1970 review had found about what had been done to them. The advocacy that eventually produced partial acknowledgement from the Ontario government did not originate with professional psychiatric organizations or parliamentary committees. It came from former patients and their families who had been finding each other slowly through the 1970s and early 1980s. As deinstitutionalization scattered the long-term population of Ontario's psychiatric institutions into communities with no infrastructure to receive them. The Canadian Mental Health Association's Ontario branch published a report in 1977 documenting the experiences of deinstitutionalized patients that included, in its appendices, former patient testimonies about institutional work assignments. Several described being required to work, the consequences of refusal, the duration of their assignments, and the absence of wages with a directness that the official records had not permitted. The report received moderate attention in the legislature. The governing Progressive Conservative government acknowledged it as documenting historical concerns being addressed by ongoing reforms. No investigation was announced. In 1981, a former Lakeshore patient named Gerald Stokes, who had spent 12 years in the institution and worked the farm for 9 of them, filed a complaint with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, alleging that his involuntary participation in unpaid farm labor constituted a violation of his rights. The Commission determined that the occupational therapy designation placed the work assignments outside its jurisdiction over employment practices. Stokes appealed. The Divisional Court upheld the Commission's determination in 1983. Its written decision noted that whether the labor program had functioned in practice as an employment relationship was a complex factual and legal question the court was not required to resolve. The court did not resolve it. In 1985, survivors and advocates incorporated the Psychiatric Survivors of Ontario. Its founder, Ruth Connors, institutionalized at Queen Street Mental Health Centre in the 1960s, who had spent 15 years after discharge rebuilding a life and learning enough about institutional history to be genuinely furious about it, testified before 2 Ontario legislative committees in the late 1980s, with specificity that made the official record's omissions visible by contrast. She described the labor assignments. She described the absence of wages. She described the documentation practices that had characterized unpaid institutional labor as therapeutic treatment. She described the 1970 review's existence. She had learned of it from a former departmental employee and formally demanded its release. The government declined. Her testimony is in the Legislative Assembly archives. In 1992, the provincial NDP government established a task force on psychiatric survivors' institutional experiences. Its 1993 report, Putting People First, recommended that the province acknowledge the patient labor system and establish a process for individual redress. Before the recommendations could be acted upon, the NDP lost the 1995 election. The incoming Harris government did not pursue them. In 1998, a class action on behalf of former patients of multiple Ontario psychiatric institutions alleged unjust enrichment by the Crown through the patient labor system. In 2003, the case settled out of court under terms sealed by court order. Each plaintiff signed a non-disclosure agreement. The settlement amount has never been disclosed. The Ontario government has never publicly acknowledged, outside that sealed settlement, that the patient labor program at Lakeshore and other provincial institutions was anything other than occupational therapy. The patient labor model that Lakeshore operated under the language of occupational therapy did not retire when the 1976 Hospitals Act amendments ended its formal structure. The logic that sustained it, that productive work performed in an institutional setting constitutes a therapeutic activity, and that this designation removes the activity from the scope of labor standards protections, has traveled into systems that continue to operate in the present. Sheltered workshop programs operating across Canada and the United States through the late 20th century and into the present arranged for people with psychiatric or developmental disabilities to perform productive work, assembly, manufacturing, packaging, agricultural production, under wage structures legally exempted from minimum wage requirements. In the United States, Section 14(c) of the Fair Labor Standards Act authorizes employers to pay disabled workers at rates below the federal minimum on the grounds that the work environment serves a vocational or training purpose. As of 2024, approximately 120,000 workers in the United States are employed under Section 14(c) certificates. Some receive wages of cents per hour for productive industrial work. The justification is vocational and therapeutic. The exemption is still in use. In Canada, several provincial social enterprise models operating in the disability and psychiatric survivor sectors have faced scrutiny for arrangements in which participants perform revenue-generating work for organizations that characterize the work as therapeutic programming rather than employment, an arrangement structurally continuous with the Lakeshore model, administered by different institutions under different language, but operating through the same foundational premise, that the clinical or therapeutic designation of an activity determines its legal character regardless of the activity's actual economic conditions. In contemporary long-term care settings, resident activities are routinely designed around what administrators describe as therapeutic programming, structured engagement intended to maintain function and morale in a population with limited alternatives. The line between therapeutic programming and the use of institutionalized people's participation to meet institutional operational needs is a line the Lakeshore model demonstrates can be erased by documentation alone, and that the 1970 review demonstrates can be erased for decades before anyone with authority notices or chooses to look. The farm at Lakeshore closed in 1976. The green account book went into storage. The logic that filled it did not close with the farm. It found new ledgers. The Humber College Lakeshore campus occupies the grounds of the former hospital at 3199 Lakeshore Boulevard West in Etobicoke. The college took possession of the property in stages following the hospital's closure in 1979. 10 of the original 12 red brick cottages still stand, renovated for academic use. Students attend classes in rooms with high Victorian ceilings and tall windows that retain the light the original designers intended. The campus is, by any measure, beautiful. The lawns between the cottages run south toward the lake. On warm days, students sit on the grass between classes. The buildings carry the particular warmth of well-maintained 19th century brick in afternoon light, and they give no indication from outside of what they held. There are no plaques on the cottage walls identifying their original function or their original occupants. There are no markers on the south grounds identifying the locations of the farm buildings, the dairy barns, the piggery, the equipment sheds, the slaughterhouse, which were demolished in the years following the hospital's closure. The fields themselves have been absorbed into the college grounds and the residential development that has advanced on the property's eastern boundary. The former farm superintendent's building, a low brick structure on the east edge of the former farm compound, still stands, now used as a college maintenance facility. The room that served as the farm superintendent's office exists. Its dimensions are unchanged. The desk is gone. The farm ledger is in the archives of Ontario, at 134 Ian MacDonald Boulevard in North York, catalogued under the series for Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital Administrative Records. It is available to researchers who know to request it. The labor hours columns are still legible after more than a century. The column for names, the column that was never filled, is still blank. In 2012, Humber College and a community arts organization installed a small public art installation on the campus grounds. It consists of stones engraved with words associated with the institution's history. The words include healing, care, community, and memory. The word labor does not appear. The word wages does not appear. One stone carries the word farm. The installation is near the path between Cottage D and Cottage F. Students walk past it on their way to class. A comprehensive historical marker identifying the patient labor program, its documented scale, the 1970 review's findings, and the sealed settlement has not been installed. The Ontario government has not announced a plan to install one. The patients who worked the fields where students now study have not been named in any public acknowledgement on the site. The grounds are maintained, as they have been since 1890, to a high standard of tidiness. The lawn is green. The lake is visible from the south windows. The brick holds the morning light the way it always has. There are 2 Lakeshore psychiatric hospitals. The first was built on a genuine commitment to the most humane psychiatric framework the 19th century produced. The cottage system was a real innovation, an improvement in terms of human scale and individual attention on the single ward blocks it replaced. The farm, in its earliest years, was integrated into institutional life in ways that some patients found meaningful. The concerts, the athletic programs, the social rhythms that moral treatment prescribed were genuine. For some patients, in some periods, what Lakeshore offered was better than what awaited them outside. The second Lakeshore was the same institution, operating the same farm, using the same paperwork, but with a different relationship between the paperwork and the reality it described. It was an institution that had discovered, by the 1930s at the latest, that patient labor was economically essential to its operation, and that the occupational therapy designation was a sufficient legal and administrative shield against any examination of that fact. It ran this discovery for 4 decades. It ran it through a provincial review that documented it and was classified. It ran it into a settlement whose terms remain sealed. Both institutions existed simultaneously in the same red brick cottages. Both were served by the same farm, the same laundry, the same boiler room. The difference between them was not in the buildings or the patients, or even, in most cases, the stated intentions of the staff. It was in the accountability structure, or rather, in its absence. No external body was required to reconcile the farm ledger with the clinical record. No labor standards authority had jurisdiction over occupational therapy. No court required the province to produce the 1970 review. The institution that called farm labor therapy was the institution that had no one to tell it otherwise. That is not a metaphor. It is a description of what happens when the people making clinical and administrative decisions inside an institution are answerable only to the government that funds it. And the government that funds it has a budget line that benefits from not asking. Some questions remain that the record does not answer. How many patients at Lakeshore and Ontario's other provincial institutions were assigned to work for longer than any documented clinical rationale supported? The 1970 review found the pattern consistent across all 5 institutions it examined. It did not produce a total count. Its full text remains classified. What were the specific terms of the 2003 court settlement? The court order sealing it does not have an expiry date. The government has not indicated it intends to seek one. What would compensation look like for people who left a psychiatric institution without employment histories, without pension credits, without the documents a tradesman needs to prove his trade to a licensing board? The question was posed in a letter written in 1985. It was acknowledged with a form reply. It has not been posed since by any government body in a context that required an answer. Who classified the 1970 review? And what specific provision of what specific statute authorized that classification to remain in force for over 50 years? The authorization is in the ministry records. The records that would identify it are themselves restricted. The farm ledger that sat on the superintendent's desk at Lakeshore is in the archives of Ontario now. A thick, green-covered account book, its ruled columns still legible after a century of storage. The labor hours run down every page, week after week, season after season, crop cycle after crop cycle, broken down by task, and crew and growing period, with the careful precision of a government accounting for a productive asset. When this story opened, the ledger looked like record keeping, a province documenting its farm, responsible administration, the kind of careful institutional accounting that suggests a government knows what it has and is tracking it honestly. By now you know what the blank name column means. The labor hours were real. The names that produced them were not required, because including them would have raised a question the column was not designed to answer. What do you owe to the person whose hours are in your ledger? That question is still here. What does a province owe to the people whose wages it kept under the name of therapy? When the instrument of the keeping was a documentation system designed to ensure the question never had to be asked, what does accountability look like once the documentation is examined? The green ledger sits in its box on Ian MacDonald Boulevard, the labor. Hours are still in it. The name column is still blank. And somewhere in the same building, in a restricted file under a classification that has outlasted the institution it was designed to protect, the 1970 review describes what anyone who read both documents would have seen, what anyone with authority was never required to see. The ledger still has room in the name column. The province has